On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the upcoming meeting of NATO leaders in London. What's on the security agenda? What's next for the alliance? And the fledgling U.S. Space Command taking off. Where's the new U.S. Combatant force headed? And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you on CGTN from Beijing. Let's begin today's show with the upcoming NATO leaders meeting. Marking the alliance's 70th anniversary, transatlantic leaders from the alliance's 29 members will meet in London on December the 3rd and 4th. This year's agenda includes the fight against terrorism, countering hybrid threats, collective security, and transatlantic relations. Hanging over the meeting are controversies over a fairer burden sharing of defense spending. So what's the outlook of this meeting? Before we turn to our panelists from those NATO countries, take a look at this first.
Tomorrow, NATO leaders meet in London for a special summit to mark the start of the alliance 70 years ago, during the Cold War. It was a time when members agreed on their aims and who the enemy was. Today, NATO leaders are politically polarized, and some are questioning the effectiveness of one of the world's biggest, if not the biggest, military alliance. French President Emmanuel Macron recently called the alliance brain dead and declared terrorism is now the enemy, not Russia or China. Mr. Macron wants this to be a wake-up call.
The questions I've asked are open questions that we haven't solved yet. Peace in Europe, the post-INF situation, the relationship with Russia, the Turkey issue, who's the enemy? So I say, as long as these questions are not resolved, let's not negotiate about cost sharing and burden sharing.
But the comments drew a sharp rebuke within the alliance. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg recently said NATO members often had different opinions, but it didn't mean the alliance has no future.
The European Union cannot defend Europe. European unity cannot replace transatlantic unity. A strong NATO and a strong European Union are two sides of the same coin.
With some of its key members expected to bring conflicting agendas at this year's meeting, what was conceived as a celebration for NATO could become a show of disunity. One challenge topping the agenda is the Syria discord with two NATO members, the U.S. and Turkey. Where American troops once kept the peace, Russian forces now patrol northern Syria. The U.S. withdrawal last month has fueled concerns over America's commitment to NATO. To make matters worse, Turkey is buying S-400 Russian anti-missile systems. Analysts believe, just like the NATO summit held last year in Brussels, this year's meeting is not going to be smooth sailing. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Turkey, and now Ukraine. Security challenges facing the alliance are more complicated.
So what's the outlook on the NATO summit? In Washington, we have John Stylides, principal at Trilogy Advisor. In Brussels, we have Fraser Cameron, a senior advisor at the European Policy Center in Brussels. In Beijing, Teng Jianchun, director of the Center for Arms Control with the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to go to you, Mr. Cameron. The French president claimed that NATO these days is brain dead. Your response to that remark, and what's going on about the future ideas and potential of NATO?
I think President Macron wanted to provoke a debate within NATO about the future of the alliance, given the doubts about the American commitment, basically because of some of the comments President Trump has made, and also his decision to pull US troops out of northern Syria without consulting NATO. So I think Macron certainly achieved his objective, and this will certainly be on the agenda when the NATO summit actually takes place.
I see, but do you think building a think tank or an expert panel, so-called, will be able to solve the problem? Mr. Cameron, very briefly, before we go to the other guests.
No, not at all. But I think there's two NATOs at work here. There's the NATO, the political NATO, where there's constant disputes about what the priority should be, and there's the military NATO, which actually operates very concretely in terms of building up new facilities, particularly in Eastern Europe. So you have to take the two into account.
Mr. Stylianides, sitting in Washington, do you agree with that two layers of NATO illustrated by Mr. Cameron in Brussels?
I think it's a very apt description of the situation we face with NATO today. The political part is going to be the problem that is going to be sorted out at the summit. What you have is a concern that there is an anachronistic institution that dates back half a century, really for a 20th century global landscape, and it really has not geopolitically or strategically reconfigured for the new threats and security concerns of the 21st century. And on a military level, the countries that are in the NATO alliance do tend to cooperate and to collaborate relatively effectively, but on a political level, you have an enormously bloated bureaucracy in Belgium, and you have the concern that there really is no such thing as Europe to speak of, that Poland and Portugal have very different security needs, Finland and France, Estonia and Ireland. And we have increasing disputes between the United States and Germany over defense budgeting, and of course between the U.S. and many NATO countries with Turkey, now that it's acquiring and soon to be activating very problematic Russian anti-aircraft missile systems.
Mr. Tang, you've been listening to your colleagues from Brussels and Washington. Of course, China is not part of the NATO, but rather China is concerned whether some of the capitals are trying to bring China as, quote-unquote, the threat for NATO. Mr. Tang, your thoughts?
Actually, this is a continuation of so-called China threat from the United States. In recent years, we repeatedly have heard such a voice from some member state of NATO, and of course this is a result of the propaganda by the United States. And you mentioned just now the brain is dead. Actually, the brain of NATO is the United States. In any military blocks established by the United States since the end of World War II, there is always only one boss and only one head in the military organization or military alliance. So this time, I'm sure some state members of NATO would like to say China is a threat. Even the Secretary General, sometimes criticized China's policy. I don't know these gentlemen are familiar with the situation in China or in the development of China. They just follow the suit of the United States.
Okay, interesting. Mr. Cameron, you got two very different opinions there. Mr. Stylianides suggesting that it's the EU countries themselves that are problem here. They better figure out what they want. While Mr. Tang is concerned that whether China will be, being described as the threat for NATO, is it going to be good for NATO's future development, though? So, Mr. Cameron, you want to respond on both sides?
Well, on the European side, there are clearly different threat perceptions, whether you're sitting in Estonia or in Portugal. I mean, the southern Mediterranean countries look to North Africa and the threat of Islamic terrorism and radicalization as a top threat, whereas if you're sitting in Poland or Estonia, you look to Russia as the threat. So that's always been the case, and I think it's trying to get the balance right, and I think that's what NATO has usually managed to do. In terms of China, I don't think anyone sees China as a particular threat to NATO, but I think there is concern that China is expanding its footprint, firstly in the Balkans, secondly in the Arctic, and that's coming close to sort of NATO's core territory. So it's simply natural that NATO wants to keep an eye to monitor what China is doing, but nobody is saying China is a threat to NATO at the moment.
But Mr. Cameron, on the other hand, though, who will drive the agenda of NATO? I think that is a very key issue here. Now, the world has been used to, at least in the western part of the world, northern part of the world, used to the U.S. leading the way. Now the U.S. is kind of withdrawing most of the time from the multilateral frameworks earlier established quite instrumentally by itself. But so in a way, what does that mean for NATO, and who will drive the next stage of NATO? If I could ask that question, your thoughts?
it will still be the United States. The United States provides overwhelmingly the largest military forces for NATO, so it has a dominant voice, and this always has been the case. There have been political disputes, as John mentioned before, but even despite Trump's comments, the military, the Pentagon, are absolutely committed to the future of the NATO alliance, and although there might well continue to be political disagreements in future, the United States will remain the dominant partner for sure.
I know. It seems interesting because the expert panel now, the NATO leaders have been talking about, is going to put out, as planned earlier, Mr. Situlidis, a future report in a way. But that report will not be available until after the U.S. election, which NATO, quote unquote, believes it will be neutral as a result of it. So, Mr. Situlidis, do you think the agenda, domestic political agenda of the U.S. and the timetable of the U.S. will in a way decide the timetable of NATO looking for a future agenda and future timetable?
The political situation will affect that planning to a certain degree, and that's only natural in any democratic nation. The decisions of government leaders have to reflect the democratic wishes as expressed through the ballot box of their respective voters, and that's certainly the case inside the NATO alliance. And you have 2.5 dozen countries, each of which have their respective political processes, which are going to be respected. And of course, the United States election will play a dominant role going forward. But
even the U.S. election will have a dominating
Fraser,
impact on the strategic decision and direction of NATO. Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, I think it goes back to Fraser's apt comment earlier, because on a military level, the establishments have worked quite well through all of these political disputes of the last several years and the last several decades. But on a political level, yes, countries have to decide to what extent they're going to be participating in a reconstruction of the NATO mission. They have to sign off on the budgeting. I mean, when Germany is pledged to spend about 1.2%, not 2% of its GDP on defense budgeting for the next decade, that's a problem for other countries because the German government's respecting the wishes of the German people. But I want to go back to the China point also, because I think China is not considered an immediate threat, but I do believe that you will see China emerging in potential arms control discussions going forward, so that where the U.S. and Russia are reworking an arms control framework, that the U.S. and maybe other countries in NATO will be urging China to participate in that framework, and also the degree to which British and French ships are engaged in freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, along with those of the United States.
Right. Mr. Tang, of course, that's a natural question for you. Now, if Washington managed to penetrate furthermore into the decision by NATO regarding China, how is China likely to work out its future relationship with NATO? Now, China and NATO were not close, but over the past few years, there have been quite some interactions on some of the not necessarily strategically crucial missions, let's just put it that way, but do have some interaction. So, Mr. Tang, is the potential worrisome, or is the potential actually should be very much expected with hope?
I think 20 years ago, there was a debate whether China should enter such a military organization at home in China, I mean. And today, I'm sure China would like to have a good cooperation with any country in NATO or in other military organizations, even established by the United States. So this is actually our basic principle, to establish the cooperation with any military organization in regional affairs, in global affairs, or even in the anti-piracy in the Aden Bay. China did have good cooperation with member states of NATO in fighting against the pirates there. So this is actually a good example for China to cooperate with any organization in maintaining the peace and stability in everywhere in the world.
But Mr. Tang, what about the controversial issues Mr. Stylianides earlier suggested, at least from China's perspective? What if NATO, it is in the name of NATO those things happened? How is China likely to deal with those potentials? And how do you think NATO countries and NATO as a whole should understand the Chinese approach at this point?
Yeah, there are quite a few channels for the two sides to have good exchanges on various issues, including terrorism, including anti-piracy. So this is a challenge, I think, for China and for NATO member states. So we can have a further in-depth discussion with our counterpart from NATO at this moment or in the future.
In-depth discussion about what, Mr. Tang? That's very important, because anti-piracy, you said the two sides already working together. What about the controversial territory disputes, and also what about the future potential of defense needs of China in some of the areas where NATO consider as important to itself?
I think number one is for the two sides, we should have a good understanding on the policy. For example, China's defense policy is defensive. We always said that we should not only look at the capability but also look at the intention of China. How can we have such a large amount of military budget and have such a large program for the arsenals in China, not only conventional arms in China, also the nuclear weapon system. And as gentlemen just mentioned, I think nuclear arm disarmament is a good topic for the two sides to have in-depth exploration.
Yeah.
How can we cooperate?
Now here's the thing, Mr. Cameron, I have to come back to you, because it is not just about whether the quote-unquote common threat of NATO will be expanded, but also what's likely to happen if Washington, given the current circumstances, would rather have a more passive role on the future development of NATO. What if the two sides on political strategic issues may not see eye to eye with one another, I mean the European countries and Washington, for the near future, which is already reflected on trade issues, also reflected on some of the other political issues around the world. Iran is also one of them. So, Mr. Cameron, may I throw back this difficult question to you once again?
Well, I actually think the Americans have a point. I mean, for 50 years, they have certainly borne the brunt of military expenditure defending Europe. And now, if you look at the situation from an American taxpayer's perspective, you look across the Atlantic and you see 500 million pretty rich Europeans who have a GDP per head as high as the United States, and you ask yourself, well, why are they not capable of defending themselves?
But Mr. Cameron, here's the thing. You could be empathetic, okay, to anyone about what they think or what they say, but whether the actions taken by nation states within NATO will necessarily follow that line of thinking and that line of action prescribed by the others is another question. So empathy does not equal to action. So help me to understand what's likely to be the actions if the capitals do not see eye to eye on some of the strategic issues, Mr. Cameron.
Well, they do actually see eye to eye on many of the strategic issues. The threat from Russia, the threat of hybrid attacks, the threat from radical Islam, etc. They're all on the same page on that.
Yeah.
Where they differ, obviously, is in contributions to the alliance and what the focus should be going forward. Now, they've just had a ministerial and agreed that space should now be included on the agenda. They basically have a framework for dealing with, out-of-area threats too. So, on 90% of issues, they basically are on the same page.
All right. Mr. Stylianides, now, the U.S. president is to participate, according to the plan, at least. So, usually it's dramatic moments when he participates. Can we expect anything specific this time?
It's tough to tell until he's actually arrived, and all of the government leaders are convening for. We're going to be some very important issues at the 70th summit. My own sense is that President Trump will continue to hammer away directly on what he feels are the defense budgeting shortfalls of certain NATO countries. I think what you'll have there are key advisors to President Trump, along with their counterparts in NATO countries, talking on a more strategic level about how to address issues regarding Russia, regarding Islamic terror. What is going to be the future of Ukraine, for instance, and other countries that are aspiring for membership in the NATO alliance? So I think this will happen on a dual-level process, but my own sense is that President Trump sees this in a very transactional manner, and from a purely fairness perspective, as Fraser began to comment earlier, why is it that these wealthy European Union countries are not stepping up to the plate to meet what is a simple commitment from the U.S., especially as for instance, in the case of Germany, are increasing their economic dependence on countries such as Russia that they're supposed to be defended from by the United States and other NATO countries.
I see.
It doesn't quite fit.
Mr. Cameron, now, it's about whether the capitals involved in NATO are going to take President Trump seriously, because there's an impeachment going on in Washington. There are a lot of things going on politically as well. There's an election next year. And meanwhile, there are trade issues between many European capitals and Washington as well. Is the current status of Washington going to be taken seriously, or rather people would like to postpone it until, how about after election?
Well, to be frank, it doesn't really matter who is the president, because whether it was Obama or Bush before him, there was a similar message coming from Washington, basically that the Europeans have to do more.
Mr. Teng, final words from you as well about the upcoming summit?
Yeah, I think this is a very important moment for NATO member states. How can they continue the process in defending the countries in European continent and for its allies? I think at this moment the big challenge for NATO is the United States. There is only one driver in the bus, and if Donald Trump would like to withdraw his military spending in this regard, or withdraw troops from European continent, that might be a disaster for the military organization or the ending of the military organization. So I think all the member states should think about the result and how can they deal with such a presence from the United States.
When you say that, I'm sure a lot of those involved in the discussion already have sweat in their hands. But for now, I want to thank the three of you gentlemen for joining us and helping us to understand much better about the agenda, possibly, for the NATO summit. We have John Sitilidis, Fraser Cameron, and Teng Zhenchen. Thank you so much, gentlemen. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. The fledgling U.S. Space Command taking off. Where is the new U.S. Combatant force headed? Some answers right after the break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight, coming to you from Beijing. Last week, foreign ministers of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, recognized space as an operational domain, giving it the same status as air, land, sea, and cyberspace. The yet-to-be-established Space Force outlined the agency's agenda, including the deployment of space warfighters. In August, the U.S. Space Command was launched, and U.S. Vice President Mike Pence said, quote, "America is leading in space once again," end of quote. With space becoming a war-fighting domain, could it lead to future military threats in space among major powers? Before we get down to a discussion also about this, take a look at the latest.
Is fending off a space invasion no longer science fiction? At a recent NATO summit, the alliance said they were adding space as the fifth domain of security concern on top of land, sea, air, and cyberspace.
NATO has no intention to put weapons in space. We are a defensive alliance, but making space an operational domain will help us ensure that all aspects are taken into account to ensure the success of our missions.
The NATO announcement is the latest sign of a rising defense space race. Earlier this year, India became the fourth country to display capacity in anti-satellite weapons, also known as ASAT, following the lead of the US, Russia, and China. There's also the trend toward creating a dedicated division for space in militaries, with the US and France already setting up space commands. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson pledges to create the UK's first space command if his party wins re-election in December. Everybody says they seek to avert a space war, but many point out taking the high ground is the best way to prevent one from breaking out.
So where is the U.S. Space Command headed to boldly go where no one has gone before? Let's turn to our panelists, both from the U.S., to help us understand better. In Washington, D.C., we have Dr. Brian Whedon, who's the Director of Program Planning for Secure World Foundation. Also in D.C., we are joined by Richard White, a security expert from Wikistrat Global Consultancy. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. The world is interested and also curious about specifically that organization. Mr. Whedon, how much can you tell us about the real nature of it, and how is it related to the other sides of the U.S. defense?
So Space Force is a reorganization of the way the U.S. military does training, recruiting, and procurement for space operations. A lot of that is currently being done by the U.S. Air Force, and there's a lot of dissatisfaction with how the U.S. Air Force is doing it. So the intent of the Space Force is to reorganize that into a separate entity that can focus on space and hopefully do a better job of it than the Air Force currently has been doing. The other entity that was recently created is U.S. Space Command.
That's right.
And the difference is that while the Space Force is focused on this training, recruiting, purchasing mission, the Space Command is focused on operations, what the military calls warfighting. So you can think of it as the Space Force would be in charge of buying and procuring new satellites and training the people to operate them, and then the Space Command is responsible for using those satellites in military operations.
Mr. White, of course, we earlier talked about this topic, but there are new developments in this regard. So what do you make of the latest development in terms of its significance in building stronger Space Command and also Space Force and the interactions between them?
Well, we've seen some progress in terms of both the areas that Brian discussed. We've seen the Space Command stand up, and we've seen Congress focus on pushing along the Space Force. And we've seen also concurrent developments. In particular, we've seen NATO, the topic of your previous session, discuss how to make space an operational domain. And these are all, I think, a recognition of the importance of space for communications, logistics, situation awareness, and so on. And then, of course, the debate everyone will be focusing on is how much should you spend, what should be your priority missions, how should the Space Command interact with other commands, how should NATO collectively buy some of these forces, or is it each going to be the case that each country will buy them and then pull them together? So there are a bunch of issues left unresolved, even despite the recent developments.
Mr. Weiss, you and I talk about that, but still, for many of our viewers who do not necessarily know all the details of this, they would compare this to the quote-unquote the strategy of Star Wars or scenarios of Star Wars decades ago. Now, Mr. Weiss, how would you describe these two very different concepts?
Sure. So the key issue is what you're seeing now is militaries using space to support operations on Earth or the sea, so that space support for terrestrial operations. There's not a great drive by any country to put weapons in space and then use these to attack other countries' space forces. Countries have these capabilities. We saw China test this capability a couple decades ago. India most recently. The U.S. and Russia, of course, have this capability during the Cold War. So they're all developing these options, but there's not an effort to really want to use those. Countries are still trying to negotiate how to prevent these kind of attacks, how to work out kinds of norms and rules of behavior. I suppose the most significant development has been the rise of these private space companies, first in the U.S. and I think now China as well. So we're going to see a lot more satellites and so on. But again, these are the issue we're trying to face is how to prevent collisions, how to prevent attacks on these forces. You know, Star Wars, when you see the movie, you think of this as putting massive space spaceships like warships in the sea in space and using them to attack other warships. We're not anywhere near there.
Mr. Whedon, of course, as Mr. White's earlier illustrated, there should be a lot of discussion about the rules, and yet many would assume with the latest geopolitical development, whether the time is on our side to develop the rules, it's a big question mark.
You know, I think you're right on that. There have been, you know, debates for at least 20, 30 years now about how do we update the existing space law framework from the core treaties that were signed in the 1960s and 70s to something more robust that does a better job of dealing with the modern challenges. Everything from not only the risk of conflict we talked about, but things like space debris and collisions and all these new commercial. But as you point out, there's a lot of, there's a growing number of countries that are involved in space, which means there are more countries that are involved in the diplomatic discussion. And those countries have a wide range of capabilities, of competence, of interests. And getting all of them to agree on something and come to consensus is really challenging. At the moment, we see there's sort of two threads that are happening. You have, on the one hand, Russia and China pushing a draft treaty on what they call the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space that is focused on preventing weapons or such as space-based missile defense being put into orbit. On the other hand, you have the U.S. and its allies pushing what they call as transparency and confidence-building measures, kind of non-legally binding ways to reduce the risk of escalation. And those are two very different perspectives. And at the moment, neither one is really making a ton of progress.
On the other hand, there is also the issue of Mr. White's the arms race. Earlier we talked about that too, but you know, with different ideas about whether a framework could ever be established. So obviously, every individual party would rush to build up more capabilities in order to defend themselves to begin with. So arms race is a potential danger over there, Mr. White.
Well, the countervailing tendencies at work, though, is that, as was mentioned, many countries now use space primarily for their commercial satellites. So you would not want to see these become more vulnerable through the development of, you know, capabilities that could be used to interfere with satellites, shoot them down. So all the countries, in principle, have an incentive to try and avert that. There's also a great expense. I mean, it costs a lot to put weapons in space, keep them there, and particularly if you use them, there's also a lot of unintended consequences. So if you blow up something in space, then it spreads debris all over the place, and that can interfere with other. So there are incentives. The problem we're facing now is that there are different definitions of what's a weapon in space. So Russia and China have a space treaty, various iterations of it. They've been pushing for international adoption, but it would seem to avoid covering some issues of concern to the Western powers and apply to others. And I think it's going to be difficult to negotiate these kind of treaties with so many parties, so many definitional issues. But the norms can perhaps be dealt with on a more technical basis. And again, there's a strong incentive to, I think, mutual deterrence, if we're going to go back to the arms race analogy, could work very well here. That if a country would refrain from attacking or interfering with another country's satellite if it's transparent enough that the party being attacked would be able to identify and respond in kind.
Now, Mr. Whedon, there are a lot of priorities, actually. I'm sure whether it comes to the budget or come to the future planning, that one government such as that in Washington has to struggle with, just like many governments around the world. Now, develop the Space Force and Space Command is one thing. The Congress is working on that, but how much priority will it occupy on the agenda? And compared to particularly to some of the most important development in the digital world. So how do you see the struggling of priorities at this time for Washington?
No, it's a great question. It's a really good point. Space has always struggled to find itself to be the priority because the space world in the U.S., even though the U.S. spends the most on military and national space, it is still much smaller in terms of people and budget than the rest of the military. So that is actually part of the whole Space Force debate, is there's an emphasis to try and push the priority of space. So at the moment, you mentioned what Congress is talking about. The Space Force is wrapped up in the debates about the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. There's a lot of other issues in there. The two biggest contentious issues at the moment are Trump's demand to use Pentagon money to pay for his border wall, and then also the nuclear modernization. Those two things are tying up the process. And then you also have, I would say, Space Force as sort of the next most contentious issue. I think looking forward, we're probably going to see something like a Space Force, or maybe even called a Space Corps, that comes out of Congress. But the big question, as you hint at, is the money for it, is the budget. Right now, we're roughly about maybe $25 billion a year or so that is being spent on military space. Some people like to see that go up, but more broadly, the Congress is anticipating flat or barely increasing defense budgets for the next several years. And so any increases in space are going to have to fight for priority against increases for the Air Force, for the Navy, for the Army, all of whom want their own share of that money or to grow for the money. So I'm not certain that space is going to be able to win that fight because, you know, those other services have a lot more power within the political battles.
It is not rare news that we see military side officials have been resigning over the past few years since this administration. Meanwhile, some of the also president-appointed officials have also resigned, not just within military ranking. So how do you see all of these factors working together eventually regarding the future of Space Command or Space Force in this regard?
Well, at the moment, the top leaders in the space world, people like General Raymond, who just took over U.S. Space Command, General Hyten, who left U.S. Strategic Command, is now working for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They are, in general, very well respected. So we don't see those same level of consternation and resigning, or even really just controversies going on in the space world. It's sort of been able to stay away from that. But there is the broader question of just focus and time. There have been thousands and thousands of hours of staff time spent so far on this Space Force issue, just in doing all the planning and all the thinking about it. And even if Congress tomorrow says go ahead and create it, there's going to be thousands of more hours figuring everything from force structures and organizational charts to uniforms and rank structures. And so the question is just how much are those other issues and those other controversies and the resignings and the vacancies going to slow down all of the work that needs to go in to make this reality. I think people shouldn't underestimate just how much work needs to go into this. It's not a matter of Congress or the President just flipping a switch and all of a sudden it happens. There's a lot of work that needs to happen on the back end.
If it is a serious plan, of course. Mr. White's also about that we have seen, you know, President appointees over the past few years have been changing very frequently in some of the areas regarding military operations. If the President in your country is considering it as a signature action or signature plan he put out. Now, with the election season and with the end of the election season, we do not know the result yet. What would it mean for such a plan, which is huge budgeted and which calls a very different direction of the development of the military, and certainly caused a overall new thinking about how to interact with other players around the world. So what does that mean, Mr. Weitz? You've been through various administrations. I'm sure you understand this very sophisticatedly.
Yes. So I guess I would answer it at two levels. So there will be fluctuations depending on the political situation in the U.S. Now, the Space Command, Space Force is not a major campaign issue. So they will not influence the election. But President Trump, as you said, has made this a top priority for his administration. The Democratic candidates, depending on who faces them, I haven't seen one of them that's championed this issue. So it's possible that depending on who's elected, they may de-emphasize this issue, may want to reduce funding, may want their own kind of structure. So that would be the one. That would be a varying factor. But there's also a strong constant factor. We've seen space becoming increasingly important for many countries. That's not going to change. The U.S. is going to need space to support military operations on the ground. That's not going to change. So there are these drivers that are going to cause the U.S. military and therefore the White House and Congress have to spend a lot of time thinking about what kind of space capabilities the U.S. needs, how it's going to work with allies and partners, and then how it's going to try and work with other countries, and so on. So you'll have some variation against a larger constancy, and I think that's often true with U.S. foreign policy decisions in general.
Large variations. Thank you so much, Richard Weitz and Brian Whedon. Thank you for helping us to understand better about this very interesting development. Appreciate it. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into our search engine. Check out our Facebook and Twitter accounts as well. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching and tune in next time for more insights across China and around the world.